Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Philosophy Sharing Foundation annual lecture. This is the 8th annual lecture which is being held. This annual lecture should have been delivered 2 years ago, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to postpone the lecture. And today, we're here for this much awaited lecture. I am glad and honored to present the speakers who came for this annual lecture. Professor Peter Singer, who yesterday gave us a very interesting talk on utilitarianism, and Professor Katrina from Poland, who yesterday also gave us a very interesting lecture. The Philosophy Sharing Foundation was set up 10 years ago in 2012, 21st May, so this year we are celebrating the 10th anniversary. And we try to hold an annual lecture on a topic, particular topic, and we try to bring foreign speakers. And this year is no exception because we have Professor Singer who will be giving us a very interesting talk this evening. I would like to inform you that on the desk on my right there are books written by Professor Singer. Those of you who would like to buy any of the books, Professor Singer has accepted to sign the books which you would eventually buy. So I will not take any longer so that Professor Singer can start his lecture. And Francois now will be introducing the topics which Professor Singer will be talking about. Thank you very much. Enjoy the evening.
So the topics that will be covered today by Professor Peter Singer are, the first one is about ethics and animals, and the second one is about global poverty and effective altruism. As we all know, Peter Singer is famous for his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, a book which is considered as a landmark in the arguments in favor of animal rights and animal liberation. He presents an argument on speciesism, and today he will be presenting further his ideas. Then the second part of the evening will be about global poverty and effective altruism, whereby Professor Peter Singer will be speaking about our moral duty, about our moral compass in terms of poverty, that if we should be helping a child who is in need next to us, then we also have a certain obligation to help others, and that is what he will be explaining to us. Every session, the first talk will be about ethics and animals. Then that will be followed by a short question and answer session pertaining to the topic. After that, we'll be having a short coffee break. Then we'll have the second part on, as we mentioned, on global poverty, followed by a short question and answer session also pertaining to the topic that will be covered. And without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Peter Singer to...
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see a large audience here, and I want to thank everybody who's been responsible for organizing this event from the Philosophy Share Foundation, in particular Mr. Ian Rizzo, who's worked tirelessly to make sure that everything has come together correctly at the right time and function, and it's all gone very smoothly. So I particularly want to thank Ian, but as I say, Max Cassar and Francois for their involvement too. So I'm going to be talking about, I think I need to get down here so that I've got my slides where I can see them. So I'm going to be, as Francois said, talking about ethics and animals to begin with. And I want to start with what I call the mainstream view of ethics in animals. That is the view that is most widely accepted today. And that is the idea that we ought to be kind to animals, and we certainly should avoid being cruel to animals, but we don't really think that their interests weigh against ours, and we give ourselves a higher moral status than we give them. So when we talk, for example, about rights, we are typically talking about human rights, not the rights of non-human animals. And that means that, say that we can allow our interests to override theirs, even when we're talking about relatively minor interests of ours, certainly not interests in our survival, but rather interests that we choose to fulfill, even when that is at the expense of the most important interests of animals. So, as I say, that's what I call the mainstream view. It's not the worst view that has been put forward with regard to animals if we look back at historically, or even if we look back at the history of the Western civilization. We find certainly that there were thinkers who thought that we have no duties at all to animals, and that there's nothing that we owe to them. Thomas Aquinas, for example, says that quite explicitly, that because they don't have immortal souls and are not part of the fellowship of eternal beings, he denies that there actually is any sin against an animal. Nothing that you can do to an animal in itself is a sin. He does say that cruelty to animals might lead you to be more cruel to humans, and if that's the case, then it would be bad. But the suffering that you would inflict on the animal is not itself a reason why it would be sinful to do that. And Immanuel Kant really comes up with, for somewhat different views, a reasonably similar position, that we don't have duties to animals. He says it's because they're not self-conscious or autonomous beings as humans are. He doesn't really explain why the fact that they can suffer is not a sufficient reason to think that we do have duties to them. And in fact, it was not Kant, but Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, which I discussed yesterday with Katarzyna de Lazari-Rudek, and some of you may have been present there, who really challenged that idea that it's some higher capacity that only humans have that animals don't have that marks the line between beings with a moral status, where there's some way in which you can violate your obligations to them or do something wrong to them, and those that are not. And he asked this famous question. The question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So that's still, I think, the right approach to take, that's the most important criterion when we ask, do we owe something to beings, or is there something that might be wrong in what we do to them, and for their own sakes, rather than for the sake of consequences that it may have for other humans. So that, of course, raises the question, well, can they suffer? Because animals is a very wide category. It includes us, we're animals, and we know that we're capable of suffering, we don't deny that. But what about the other various kinds of animals that we might interact with or who we might inflict suffering on? So I think when we come to mammals and birds, there isn't going to be much disagreement that they are capable of suffering. It's not impossible to disagree with that. Descartes famously disagreed with that. He had this idea that they're really complex automata, and the sounds they make are no more a sign that they feel anything than the sounds that a clock might make. Of course, he admitted they're more complex than clocks, but after all, they were made by God, and clocks were made by humans. So that was his explanation why. But that, even when Descartes put it forward, was really contrary to common sense. Most people, Voltaire strongly condemned it, and I don't think that many people who would hold that view today, and I would extend it to all vertebrates. I don't think that that's very much more controversial, given that vertebrates have somewhat similar nervous systems, and of course they have a common evolutionary origin. So if the systems function in a certain way in humans, it seems plausible to believe that they function in a certain way in other vertebrates. Again, that's, with each step on this ladder, there's a little bit more controversy. Some people question whether fish can suffer because of differences in their brain. But I think the best view now is that it's highly probable, if not quite absolutely certain, that they can. For example, experiments were done in which bee venom was injected into the lips of fish. Fish, particularly these were bottom-dwelling fish, they use their lips to go through the bottom of a river and see what's edible and what isn't. When the bee venom was injected, they changed their behavior. They effectively behaved as if the lips were much more tender and sensitive to pain. When they were then given analgesics, the same analgesics that reduce pain in humans, the behavior returned closer to normal. So it does look like as if things are working in the same way. Now, if we come to invertebrates, the evolutionary common link goes much further back. And that's why some people have questioned that, and differences in the nervous system, have questioned whether invertebrates are capable of feeling pain. But when you look at the behavior of octopus, and some of you will have seen the film, The Octopus, My Teacher, which had worldwide distribution last year, or you can look at videos of octopuses solving puzzles online. They seem to be pretty good at that. And it's hard to believe that they're not conscious beings when they do that, even though the common ancestor of a human and an octopus is a very simple worm-like creature which quite plausibly was not conscious. And if that's so, then it's interesting because it suggests that mind, consciousness, has actually evolved twice, at least, on this planet. So separately in the cephalopods anyway, the octopus, squid. So I think that's also highly plausible. Now, what about crustaceans? Again, rather different, complex nervous systems. But it's interesting that research has been done on some of the crustacea. There's an order of crustacea called decapod crustacea, which includes lobsters and crabs. And there's reasonably good evidence of the same kind that I just gave you for fish, that they can also feel pain. And there are some countries that have now started to protect them. Norway has got anti-cruelty provisions for decapod crustacea. And in the United Kingdom, where they're just passing a law, I think it's still in Parliament, to give animals the status of sentient beings, which of course they had when Britain was in the EU, because that's part of EU basic legislation. But when they left, there were a lot of protests from animal advocates saying, well, animals are going to lose their status as sentient beings. And Boris Johnson said, no, we'll legislate for that, and that's what's going on now. And the current version of the bill, as I understand it, includes lobsters and crabs as sentient beings. So I think there's a reasonable case there. Now, how far does that go? What about insects? And again, that's a vast variety of beings. It's imaginable that bees are sentient and that some other insects are not. So I think we'd have to be somewhat agnostic about that. And if you come to simple bivalves, simple mollusks that don't really move around and therefore might have less need, might have less evolutionary value in evolving a capacity to feel pain, it's more plausible, I think, that clams and oysters and mussels may not feel pain. I wouldn't say you can be completely sure about that, but I'd say the balance of probability has shifted from the earlier examples, say it's more likely that they can, to saying perhaps it's more likely that they can't. So I think that indicates how careful we need to be in thinking about the interests of non-human animals, depending on whether they can suffer. Now, having gone through some of that factual background, the next question is, well, what's wrong with them suffering? Why is that a bad thing? And my essential argument is that to discriminate on the basis of species alone is a prejudice that is not justified, and it's in some ways analogous, and I say in some ways, analogies are never really complete, and this one is certainly not complete, but in some ways it's analogous to other biases that we're quite familiar with, such as racism and sexism. So the analogy that I want to draw is to say, in all of these cases, we have a group which has been dominant, which has been more powerful than those outside that group. So in the case of racism, it was those of European descent as compared, say, with those of African descent. And the Europeans had the technology, the weapons and so on, that meant that they could capture and enslave Africans and transport them over to the New World and force them to work on plantations. Now, if you look at the literature from that time, there's various kinds of justifications that are given for saying why this is okay. Today we think all of those justifications are completely spurious, and we say, well, they believed that because it was convenient. People were making money out of the slave trade and out of using slave labor, and it gave them higher status. They could lord it over people of African descent and use them as slaves, domestic servants, and so on. So that was spurious. And we see something similar with the idea that only men ought to have rights to vote or to rule countries, or to, for that matter, should be the lord of the manor, should be the boss of the household, and women should accept a subordinate status. And again, the justifications for that today we also can see as simply spurious justifications that men accepted because it was convenient for them and gave them this superior status. So I'm asking you to think about the possibility that the attitudes that we have to animals, including that mainstream view I mentioned, which essentially says our interests trump theirs, but that is also spurious, and that we have accepted it because it's convenient for us. It enables us to feel justified in using animals in all kinds of ways for our convenience. And I'll talk about at least the most important of those ways shortly. So if that's so, then that explains why it's so prevalent. And of course, one difference between that and racism and sexism is that races who were repressed by the dominant race did have the ability to speak up and rebel and protest, and they did that. And women too had feminist movements and wrote works arguing that there's no justification for regarding women as inferior. But animals are not capable of doing that. And so it's easier for that to be a more universally accepted view, almost universally accepted view. It takes other humans to stand up for them and say that this is wrong. Okay, so I want to just briefly distinguish two kinds of speciesism. The kind that I've been talking about up to now is what you might call anthropocentric speciesism, the idea that, as I've said, human interests matter more than the similar interests of any non-human animal. Just the fact that they're the interests of a human, of a member of the species Homo sapien, means that they count more than the interests of any other species. A second kind of speciesism is that the interests of some animals matter more than the interests of others. And the widest form of that is the preference we give to our companion animals, to dogs and cats, perhaps to horses, or in specific cases, there may be other animals that people are fond of and treat in a special way. And we see this when we see that people do things to other animals quite similar as far as we can tell in their capacities to the companion animals, that we would not do to a companion animal. So one example would be the way we treat pigs in intensive farms, keeping them confined indoors in very crowded conditions, and until the last few years in Europe and still in many other countries, keeping the breeding sows so that they can't turn around. They were kept in narrow stalls, and still are kept, as I say, in many countries, including most of the United States. Stalls too small for them to turn around or even walk a single step forwards or backwards. So would you do that to a dog? No, if you did that to a dog and somebody found out about it, you might well be fined for cruelty. But you can do it to thousands, tens of thousands of pigs on a big factory farm, and certainly nobody is going to say that it's cruelty. In fact, there are laws passed that specifically exempt in many states of the United States, including all the states where the biggest factory farms are. There are laws saying that anything that is a common farm practice is not cruelty. So there are clauses added to acts that prohibit certain actions towards animals, essentially exempting what is a common farm practice. So that's an example of this other kind of speciesism where we favour the dogs but allow and in most cases actually consume the products of pigs who've been treated in ways that we would not accept for dogs. And it's not for nothing that George Orwell in Animal Farm made the pigs, not the dogs, the rulers of the farm after the revolution. Pigs are pretty smart animals. So I don't think you can say that dogs are in general smarter than pigs. Okay, so what's the principle that I want to put up instead of the speciesist bias or instead of the mainstream view? It's a principle that I call equal consideration of interests, but to spell out fully you might want to say equal consideration for similar interests, because what it says is we ought to give equal weight to similar interests irrespective of the species of the being whose interests they are. And it doesn't deny that different beings, including some cases humans as compared to non-human animals, will have different interests. So here's a image of some cows grazing with their calves on an organic farm in New Jersey, not far from Princeton University where I teach. And basically you could say, at least at this particular moment, the interests of the cows and their calves are being fully met. They have plenty of grass, as you can see. They're free to graze where they are. The calves are with their mothers, and the mothers are part of a social group, which is appropriate for that species. So their interests are satisfied, at least at that point in time. Eventually the calves will be taken away and killed, but for the moment their interests are satisfied. Human interests, of course, are not satisfied just by having enough to eat, being part of a certain social group, and being protected from predators. Certainly we have interests in a whole range of activities which require education to some extent in the societies in which we live, so we have an interest in being educated in ways that cows don't. And arguably we have an interest in continuing to live to fulfill and meet our plans and goals to a degree that non-human animals, or most non-human animals, are not likely to have. So that may also be a different kind of interest in continuing to live, and therefore arguably a different kind of wrong that is done to a human being when that human being is killed than is done to a non-human animal. Which is not to say that killing the non-human animal is a matter of no consequence, but rather to say that you might still draw distinctions in the seriousness of what's happening based on the nature of the being. Okay, so at this point, many of you may be thinking that there are important differences between humans and non-human animals. I just actually mentioned one of them, and that is going to make a difference to the weight we give to their interests, contrary to the principle of equal consideration of interests that I just discussed. And you can have a list that might begin by saying humans are rational, humans are self-aware. Kant might have said those two things. They're autonomous, you might have said as well. We are moral agents, they are not. We use language, they don't. And we're able to take part in a social contract. If you have a social contract-based theory of morality, that we owe things to other humans because we're kind of in an implicit contract where we don't do things to them and they don't do those things to us. So all of these criteria have been used at some point to try and say this is why there are these human rights and why animals don't have rights, or this is why we have a higher moral status than non-human animals. But Bentham had something to say about that as well. And this is after the bit that I gave you before, where he said the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer. He asked, what else is it that should trace the insuperable line? That is, again, the line that gives some beings this special moral status. And he asked, is it the faculty of reason or perhaps the faculty of discourse, being able to use language in other words, but a full-grown horse or a dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. And I think that's clearly true. Those of you who spend time with children, very young children, will know that they don't actually have the ability to reason or to talk at that age. And if we say you need to have those capacities in order to have moral status, we would have to deny that moral status to very young human beings. Now, sorry, I had a bit more to say before I move on there. I thought there was another slide about it. Now, you might be thinking, well, yes, but humans have special moral status because they have the potential to develop into beings capable of reasoning or being self-aware or autonomous or moral agents or whatever it might be. But if that's the argument that we're going to make, then it still is going to leave some humans outside this circle of beings with the higher moral status. Because there are some humans who will never develop those capacities. There are humans who have either had a genetic abnormality, that means their brains have not developed in the way that is required to have those capacities, or there may be humans who, let's say, were born extremely prematurely and suffered a major brain hemorrhage, massive bleeding in the brain, and for that reason they will not develop these capacities. Are we prepared to say that they therefore have the inferior moral status that we now give to non-human animals? Obviously we use non-human animals for food, that we could, if we wish, do that with other humans, or probably of more practical significance, that we could perform experiments on them under the same principles that we use with non-human animals. Of course, we may have some guidelines for experiments on animals. Again, the EU clearly does have guidelines on that, but they certainly don't give the kind of protection that the guidelines for experiments on living human subjects do. So if you think that the lack of those higher cognitive capacities is what justifies us in doing experiments on non-human animals that we would never do to humans, you would have to think it would justify us in doing those experiments on these human beings who lack those capacities as well. So I don't think we should say that. I think that we should regard the capacity to suffer as the more basic criterion, and apply the principle of equal consideration of interests to all beings who can suffer. Okay, now I want to just move to the practical issue that, as I mentioned, there are implications of speciesism that we regard as justifying us to use animals in certain ways that are convenient for us. And by far the largest of these ways is the use of animals for food. I did just mention the use of animals in experimentation. Of course, animals are also used for fur. They're also used in circuses. They may be used in many countries anyway to pull loads. There's a whole lot of different uses. But the one that really dominates our treatment of animals, I believe, is raising them for food. And even if you just look at vertebrate land-based animals, the UN figures that around 74 billion animals are raised and killed for food each year, whereas the best estimates I've seen for the number of animals used in research are around 200 million. Still a large number, but it's 370 times as many animals being raised and killed for food as being used in research. And that doesn't include fish, and we are now raising more and more fish in so-called aquaculture, essentially factory farming in the water. And if you add that in, estimates, it's not easy to get accurate figures, but it's quite possible that that more than doubles the total number of vertebrate animals we're raising for food. That is, that it's maybe as much as 80 or 90 billion animals, billion fish that we're raising just, and that's just talking about actually raising them. It's not talking about wild-caught fish. So I think this is, if we're concerned about speciesism, if we're concerned about not giving sufficient weight to the interests of animals, this is the issue that we ought to be focusing on. But unfortunately, we're not, at least when it comes to financial donations. Now, I don't know if you can see this at the back of the room, but these two boxes, the box here shows on the left the number of animals killed or used each year. This is just for the United States, because the figures were just for the United States. And so you can see the farm animals are the grey, and probably, unless you're sitting in the front row, you can hardly see anything else. But even if you're sitting in the front row, you can only see a small box down in the corner there, which is brown and which is laboratory animals. And you would really need good eyes to be able to see that there's a thin stripe of the shelters, the green, and an even thinner stripe of the dark brown, which is clothing, fur in particular. So it's tiny numbers by comparison. But now look at this box, which is where does the money go that people who care about animals are donating to charities? And the money goes mostly to shelters, dogs and cats in other words. Some of it, this is just other, this is a general category. A lot of this will be wild animals, protecting rare endangered species and so on. And then you've got farm animals, just this little bar here, and laboratory animals, similar sized bar there. So it's quite disproportionate in terms of the amount of suffering being prevented. And when I talk about effective altruism after our break, you'll see this is an example of what I would say as ineffective or at least less effective altruism. If people gave more to organizations fighting factory farming, they would be likely to be reducing animal suffering more than by continuing to give to the much smaller number of animals suffering, dogs and cats in shelters. Okay, and that, by the way, is courtesy of animal charity evaluators. And if you do want to try to find which are effective charities, go and look at animal charity evaluators. It gives you some information. Although it's American-based, it has recently been starting to include other charities, including ones operating in the EU. So it's definitely worth looking at. Okay, now I just want to show you some of the major systems of factory farming. These are pigs, as you can see. These are not the sows that I was talking about, which in the EU are not anymore allowed to be kept in those narrow crates that they can't turn around in. But these are the pigs who are going to end up being sent to market and eaten. And as you can see, they're extremely crowded, but basically that's the way they live pretty much all their lives once after they're taken away from their mothers. And they don't have anything to do really there except they get given food, of course, and they eat that fairly quickly, and that's the end of it. A pig in nature, in a forest, will spend a lot of the day foraging, rooting around, looking for food. They're active animals. As I said, they're intelligent animals. And even when they're on farms, more traditional farms, they will spend a lot of time rooting around pasture if they're allowed out on pasture. And a lot of pig farmers have found that just giving them other things to do, distributing their food in such a way that they have to sift it out of non-edible things actually helps them and makes them, gives them something to do, and they're more active and their well-being is raised. But anything that increases the costs of managing animals in factory farms is not going to be used because you're competing in a market economy. It's unlikely that your customers are going to pay a premium for knowing that the pigs were slightly better cared for. Maybe if they're fully organic, they will get a premium, but otherwise they won't. So, anything else is going to cost money, even just in terms of labour of cleaning the place out. So, it's not going to happen. These are chickens raised for meat, and this is a quote from a veterinarian who's really one of the pioneers of research into animal welfare with farmed animals in the United Kingdom. John Webster founded the Centre for Animal Welfare at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, which became one of Europe's biggest research centres into the welfare of animals on farms. And this is a quote from him. He says, "The single most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to another sentient animal." So why is that? Well, one is the scale. Of those 74 billion animals raised for food each year that I mentioned, probably something like 50 billion or more are going to be chickens. It's a very popular consumption, as you would know, and of course chickens are small, so you don't, you go through a lot of them, unlike cows, for example. But there's more to it than that. It's also the way chickens have been bred to grow extremely quickly and therefore reduce the amount of time that you need to raise them to market weight. The result of that is you have chickens that eat voraciously, put on weight very fast, and their leg bones are immature and struggle to bear the weight of their body. And here's an example of this. If you have chickens sort of out in a traditional way, able to walk around an orchard or a farmyard or something, you won't see chickens sitting down in this position. This is a chicken whose legs have collapsed under them and is probably unable to move at all. And if they're unable to move, then this one is not going to be able to get food or water. Now, you might think, oh, well, someone is going to notice that and do something about it. That's unlikely. Again, because of reducing the cost of labour to the bare minimum. You can find farming magazines which will say quite comfortably, one person can look after 100,000 birds in modern intensive systems. Well, look after doesn't mean that you're caring for any individual birds. What it means is you walk through the shed once or twice a day and you remove the corpses. That's about it. So these birds will die from dehydration or starvation more likely than somebody noticing them, picking them up and wringing their neck. That may happen occasionally. But the mortality for birds that actually do not survive to slaughter is, as a percentage, is not particularly high, but it means it runs into hundreds of millions of birds who actually die painful deaths rather than making it all the way to slaughter. Okay, briefly, laying hens. Again, there have been improvements in the European Union in although hens can still be kept in cages, they're no longer as crowded as they used to be. They are required to have a nesting box to lay their eggs in, which is a basic instinct that they have. So the EU is a bit ahead of, again, most of the United States and a number of other countries in this. But, and you may know, this is a bird who's been so crowded that it's rubbed against the wire and lost most of the feathers. This may be slightly better conditions, but still, if you're not buying free-range or cage-free eggs, you're still buying eggs from hens that are still reasonably crowded and still in cages. This is a lucky battery hen that normally hens will be killed when they've been laying for about a year because the rate of lay drops off and it's no longer economic to keep them. But this one was rescued by an animal organization. You can see how they've lost the feathers, the wing and tail feathers, and how the skin is rubbed from there. Normally they would just be killed at that point. They have virtually no commercial value. But this one is out in grass, and the interesting thing is, so here's a bird who's never been on grass before, was raised, may be able to roam around as a chick, but then once the hens get ready to lay, after a few months, they're in cages all of their life, and then normally they get killed. But if you take a bird and rescue it and put it out on grass, it behaves just like a hen would behave. So it runs around chasing insects that it can see. If it finds a patch of dirt, it will dust bathe. It's a natural instinct that hens have to flap up dust around their wings, may help to control parasites. And when the time comes to lay an egg, even if they've been in a bare wire cage without any nesting box and never had a chance to lay an egg in a sort of more secure private place, that's what they will do. They will find stuff to build a nest with and lay the egg out in a nest. So these are birds that do have instincts that we have not bred out of them just by breeding them to grow faster, and those instincts are denied and thwarted.
Thank you very much, Professor Singer. Me and my colleagues here are from Animal Liberation Malta. We're so honored to be here, and thank you so much for today. More than a question, I would like from you, whatever you are willing, whatever time you are willing to give to this request, is an advice on how to continue doing what we do, that is try to try and avoid as much animal suffering as possible, and how we can convince other people to adopt a vegan lifestyle, which we believe is or let's say one of the solutions in that direction.
Thank you very much. I didn't know there was an animal liberation organization in Malta, so thank you for enlightening me about that. I'm pleased to hear it. It's difficult for me to give advice because advice has to be tailored to a knowledge of the local circumstances, of the institutions, and how you can change things. For example, I've spent quite a lot of time both in European countries generally and mostly in the United Kingdom and in Australia and also in the United States. And I think in Europe and to some extent in Australia, I encourage organisations to try to work for legislative change through Parliament. So Australia, for example, has two major political parties, and one of the really bad things we do is we export sheep in quite large numbers and some cattle to other countries. The sheep mostly go to the Middle East. It's a very arduous voyage for them. There's quite a number that die on the voyage because they don't adjust to the conditions, the different food, the motion of the ship. And when they get to the Middle East, Persian Gulf countries in particular, they're often handled in ways that would not be acceptable either in Australia or Europe. So there's been a movement to try to stop this. And the Labor Party did say before the last election, they were then the opposition, that they would stop the live export trade. They have now been elected to the governing party, which they just took up in the last week. Of course, there's still a problem to hold politicians to their promises. You may be familiar with that. So, we wait and see, but it's a possible way of making progress. And I think a lot of progress has actually been made in Europe, as I was been saying, through political organizations. I've been involved to some extent with the Euro Group for Animal Welfare. You perhaps know them. From an animal liberation standpoint, they're a reforming organization. They're not really a animal liberation organization, that's true. But I do think that the changes that I've mentioned significantly reduce the suffering of animals in factory farms. And I think that's worth doing because while, as you indicated, the real solution would be for everybody to be vegan and then we wouldn't have this problem of 74 billion animals being, land animals being raised and killed for food, I still see that as some way off. I don't see us as getting to that point. I am heartened by the dramatic increase in vegan eating over the last 10 to 20 years. That's really encouraging, and you know, I've noticed looking at places to eat around here that a lot of them do marked dishes as vegan. That's very good. They're clearly catering to demand from people who are eating there. So that is a good thing to promote and to get more people doing that and to encourage the availability of more plant-based foods. Incidentally, I noticed in this hotel, if you want a plant-based milk for breakfast, you have to specifically ask a waiter for it and they bring it to you in a small jug, whereas both skim milk and full-fat milk are available, you just serve yourself. So it might be a good idea to suggest to them that they would actually save the time of the waiters if they just had one of those containers with a plant-based milk in it. But those are good things to do, and I think it's worth supporting these initiatives in Europe, even though we would like to go further. So I'm really suggesting combining, trying to get legislation, maybe specific legislation in Malta, I don't know to what extent that's possible, or supporting moves for better legislation in the EU for animals. You know, I've been focusing on farm animals, but certainly laboratory animals. There's been a ban on cosmetics, use of animals in cosmetics in the EU, which is something else I welcome. Trying to improve those things is also worth doing, while basically a dual strategy of also making vegan eating as accessible and attractive as possible. Thank you.
Can take one other question.
You spoke of improvements with welfare of layers. As a vet for 50 years, I'm a bit off the pace in some areas. And one thing that interests me is traditionally with layers, it's been normal to dispose of male day-old layers in giant food processors.
Yeah, basically grinding the things that grind them up.
Yep.
Yeah.
There is now some move around, and I haven't read in detail, and I wonder, as you're redoing your animal liberation
I'm familiar
book,
with what you're talking about.
With CO2 being used to suffocate them. That has now become the standard procedure. I haven't gone into the details of that, and I wonder if there's any information on the pros and cons of suffocating day-old male layers with CO2.
Probably CO2 is to be preferred over grinding them up, but there is a better option that is now being developed, and that is sexing the eggs. Yes. It can be done, and my understanding, some of you here may know, is that in France that's going to be required by the end of this year, and I think Germany is not far behind, if I remember rightly. Does anybody have accurate information on that? Okay. Right. I'm not. Right. So you're going to be able to separate the eggs, and you won't have any male chicks of the egg-laying breeds hatching. And I understand this can be done reasonably early, so it's not likely that the embryo is going to be capable of feeling any pain. So I see that as the best solution to this problem. And I hope that it spreads not only throughout Europe, but everywhere else that is producing eggs. My understanding is that France and Germany have legislation phasing it in, but I don't know about anywhere else. Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Singer. My name is also Peter.
Hi. Please stand up, yes.
Okay. I will try to make the question short. I wanted to ask, as you were discussing, I'm a biology student, so I know the differences a bit between animals and plants. And recently I've read certain articles suggesting that even plants feel certain pain that animals and us, we would feel. So are we to apply the same sort of rights that we apply to animals and to ourselves to these plants? Because if so, I sort of wonder, one of the questions is sort of what are we meant to eat?
Right.
Furthermore, I also was thinking about your equal consideration of interests argument, and I was wondering, so if they are also to feel the same amount of pain, we have to apply the same considerations towards them as we are applying to these animals. But also, I think there should be certain considerations applied to us. If you know, Leonardo da Vinci once made the Vesuvian Man to show us how much space we will need in particular. As you were saying, pigs or chickens need a certain amount of space, a free range, but here we are in this very grand room, even though we don't need so much space. So I think even we should lower the amount of things we need, not just increase what animals need.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm certainly in favour of trying to reduce consumption, which is causing a great deal of damage to the planet. But on the question of whether plants feel pain, it's true that there have been some interesting writing of, I would say, varying quality in scientific terms that suggests that plants are more complex than we have realised, to suggest that in some ways they may communicate with each other. But you know, when you're using terms like communicate, it's difficult to avoid you know, something that may just be a metaphor. So it may be that chemicals emitted from plants lead to certain responses in other plants, and that has some benefits for the species as a whole, perhaps, or for those trees who are responding. I haven't seen anything, I have to say, that has really convinced me that there is plant consciousness, that there is a state that it is like to be a tree or a cabbage or whatever it might be, in the sense that there's something that it's like to be one of us, and there's something that it's like to be to be one of those pigs or chickens. So, you know, I'm prepared to admit that it could turn out that I'm wrong about this. It could turn out that there is such evidence. And then you raise very appropriately the question, well, what do we do then? So a couple of things to be said about that. One is, it might still be the case that the sentience is of a lower kind in some sense, a duller kind, that there isn't the capacity for pain in the same way. I mentioned, for example, about oysters, that the fact that they don't really move is a reason for thinking that they may not have evolved a capacity of pain, and the same, of course, could be said for plants. But the other thing that's to be said is, if you're eating meat of some kind, you're responsible for the destruction of far more plants than if you eat the plants directly, because of course these animals have to eat things, and you know, when you feed plants to animals, you get back, in the case of chickens, maybe a third of the food value that you put into them, and in the case of cows, maybe an eighth or a tenth. So we will be growing plants to feed these animals. We'll be growing grains or soy to feed these animals. And if you're worried about causing suffering to plants, I still think it follows that we ought to eat plants rather than animals, even if they can suffer. Good, thank you very much. So we'll go on to the second topic. And I should, by the way, say that I've chosen these two topics to speak about because I do think they are the most significant of the things I've worked on. I've worked on a number of other areas, including, of course, issues in bioethics, life and death decisions in medical care, for example, and a range of other issues. I'm very concerned about climate change. That's certainly an important issue. But I think these two are the ones where where I've done the most work that I think is related to really important issues. So I'm going to talk now about, as you see, about effective altruism and global poverty. And I want to start with talking about effective altruism. That's a term that some of you will be familiar with, but probably not all of you. It's come into existence really only in the last decade or so. Altruism, of course, is a term that's been around for a long time. Altruism is essentially doing good for others, thinking about others, whoever those others may be, and not only thinking about yourself. And we all know what it is to be effective, but putting this together as effective altruism is something new, and it's a movement that has, I think, already made significant progress in developing that idea and encouraging people to think about it. The most obvious way of thinking about it is in thinking about what causes to choose to work on. Because if we say, I want to make the world a better place, the next question is, yes, but in what way are you going to do that? I've just been talking about one of them. So one way you can make the world a better place is by trying to reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering we inflict on animals. And I've suggested that that's a good thing to do. And in terms of effectiveness, I've suggested it's good to think about farmed animals rather than shelters for dogs and cats. But we can apply this way of thinking much more broadly to a whole range of causes. And then you have the question, well, how do we decide which of the causes to take up, in whatever way you're going to take them up? And I'll talk about that soon too. So here's something that some of the effective altruists have come up with. Thinkers like Will MacAskill has been talking about these things. Importance, neglectedness, and tractability. So importance means, suppose you could change things in this area, how big a difference would that make to the world? Well, you can think of a whole range of different causes that would make very different sorts of impacts on the world. You might work at something at your national level. Well, Malta is a relatively small country. It might be good for Malta, but what's that? It's going to be good for about 500,000 people. That's nice, but it doesn't compare with some of the other issues that the world faces. And currently, we have about 800 million people living in extreme poverty, as defined by the World Bank. And so this is clearly an important issue. It's an issue that is going to affect a lot of people. Secondly, neglectedness. Now, why is neglectedness important when thinking about your own altruism and its effectiveness? It's important because if there are a lot of other people already working on this issue, people who maybe have the talents or resources that you have, the chances that you're going to make a significant difference are clearly reduced as compared with if the issue is one that very few people are working on or doing anything about. So global poverty, I'm saying here, it's very neglected when compared to many affluent world issues. Well, I'm not saying it's very neglected full stop, because clearly a lot of people do think about global poverty. There are a variety of organizations that are working to do something to help people in extreme poverty. So it's not a totally neglected issue, but it's relatively neglected compared, say, if you think about the amount of resources that go into trying to find cures for cancer. Cancer is largely, not entirely, a disease that affects people in affluent countries. Certainly, the proportion of people who die of cancer in affluent countries is greater than in other countries because there are all these other causes that they die from. So there's an immense amount of money going into research into cancer in affluent countries. And I'm not saying that that's not important. There are a lot of people dying from cancer, and it would be great if you could find cures for it. But I would say that in comparison, the resources that go to helping people in extreme poverty mean that that's a relatively neglected topic compared to that and compared to a number of other issues that we're concerned with. And the third one is tractability. That is, can you really do something about it? So it's good to choose an issue where you have a reasonable chance of actually changing something. And there are some issues which it's very hard to change things. We may not even know how to change things. Certainly, I mean, despite all the money going into cancer research, there are many forms of cancer where we haven't made a great deal of progress. We can maybe extend life briefly, but we certainly haven't found cures. And there's a lot of other issues. Trying to prevent war, for example. Is that a tractable issue? Well, it doesn't look very tractable just at the moment. You might have been more optimistic a few months ago that we'd made certain progress. And again, I'm not saying it's not worth trying to do things, but some things it's really difficult to know how we can stop. Whereas extreme poverty is, I think, a soluble issue. Soluble not in the sense of having zero people in extreme poverty. No doubt there'll always be, I mean, partly perhaps because there may be wars and civil wars, which, as the war in Yemen has meant more people are in extreme poverty than would be if there were no war. And that may continue to happen on a local scale. But the idea that there are hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty in a world that has this much affluence in it is, I think, something that we really could change if we had the will to do it. So those are three things that effective altruists talk about, suggest you might think when we're deciding which are the causes that we ought to work on. Okay, so I am going to talk about extreme poverty, as I said, and it's good again to have some basic facts about that. Whoops. So what is extreme poverty? Let's go with the World Bank's definition. They use this term. The extremely poor are those without enough income to meet basic needs, or sometimes they say reliably to meet basic needs. You may have enough income to meet basic needs when everything goes smoothly and you have a good harvest, but if the rains fail, then you're in dire trouble. So that's the first criteria. Now, this means, roughly speaking, living on less than $1.90 US per day. And you might think, those of you particularly who've travelled in low-income countries, that the dollar goes so far, or the euro goes so far in some of these countries, that it wouldn't be all that difficult to live on a couple of dollars, 2 euros or something like that a day. But the phrase purchasing power parity takes care of that difference. So it's not what you would get when you go to a low-income country and you go to the bank and you say, here's $2 or here's $200. It's not what you get back in terms of the currency. It's what buys the same thing in the low-income country as the $1.90 or $2 buys in the United States, or the 2 euros buys here. So it's much less. And when you think about that, you wonder how people actually can survive even on that, or even on a little bit more than that. So it's quite a low bar. And this is, as I say, extreme poverty. It's not people who are in relative poverty compared to levels of affluence in an affluent country. So that's a pre-COVID figure there. In 2019, about 734 million people were below this line. And that is quite a lot of people, although there has been significant improvement, as you can see from this graph, looking at declines between 1990 and 2017. And the interesting thing is that it's not only the rate of global poverty, that is the percent of the population that's in extreme poverty that's fallen. That's the left-hand graph. But even in terms of numbers, despite the fact that the world's population is increasing, there have actually been, over that period, 1990 to 2017, fewer people living in extreme poverty. So some people will say to you, well, the poor are always with us. It's like pouring your money down the drain. We're never going to get anywhere with dealing with reducing extreme poverty. That's demonstrably false. We have got quite a long way in terms of reducing extreme poverty. and there's no reason why we can't go further. And that's reflected also not just in the poverty figures, but in UNICEF, the UN Children's Foundation figures, for the number of children who die before their 5th birthday. And these figures are overwhelmingly poverty-related deaths. So in 1990, it was 12.5 million dying each year. In 2019, it was 5.2 million. So cut into less than half in what's that, 29 years. So again, we've made good progress on that. Now, it's true that the COVID has meant that we've actually gone a little bit backwards. And this is the first upward blip since, well, certainly since 1990, and I think actually you could go back quite a bit further than that. So these are estimates, the 2 lines that go up from the line there, as to what happened with COVID. It went up to, this is now in percentage, right? Not in absolute numbers. So it went from 8.4% of the world's population to somewhere between 9.1 and 9.4. But it has started to drop again, and in fact, this is a 2020 predictions of where it might go. It has come down again, and I think there's reason to hope that it will resume that decline. So yes, we lost a couple of years of decline, but it doesn't look like it's irreversibly changed. Okay, so what have I done with my water? So that's some of the basic facts about extreme poverty. But I'm interested in ethics, and so I'm interested in what we ought to be doing about it. Oops, that's not a good place to put my glass of water, is it? Okay. Right, so I think Francois mentioned in the introduction, I've used this little story about a child drowning in a pond, going right back to the first article I ever wrote on this in the 1970s, to sort of get a grip on what obligations we might have for harms that we are not, to prevent harms that we are not responsible for. I asked my readers to imagine that they are walking across a park. It's a park that they're familiar with, and the park has a pond in it, and they know that it's quite a shallow pond. In summer, kids play in the pond, and it's only waist deep on a teenager. But today it's not summer, there's nobody playing in the pond, you're not expecting to see anyone in the pond. But as you walk across the park, you notice that there is something splashing in the pond. And as you get closer, you see that it's actually a child, but a very small child, a child too small to stand up in this pond, and this child appears to be in great danger of drowning. Of course, you would think that there would be parents looking after the child or a babysitter or someone, but there's nobody that you can see. So you realize that the child is probably going to drown unless you jump into the pond as quickly as you can and haul the child out. But then you have the thought that, as bad luck would have it, you're going somewhere important, you've got your best clothes and your best shoes on, and you don't have time to get them off, the child might drown, and if you jump into the pond with them, they'll probably get ruined. It's not the kind of clothing that is going to recover from jumping into a muddy pond. So there is some cost to you in doing this. And then you think, well, what if I just forget that I'd ever seen the child and go on my way to my commitment? Would that be okay? Now, I can ask you, do you think that would be okay? No. Anybody want to say it'd be okay? I don't. Occasionally there is some bold soul who puts their hands up. Where are the parents? Well, absolutely, where are the parents? The parents are neglectful of their children, of their child. It's their responsibility. But are you going to say, therefore I'm going to let the child drown? Not your child. Okay. Well, maybe my argument won't apply if you're going to say that, but I think most of the audience is not going to agree with you about that. That's generally my experience. So it would be wrong, they would say, I think most of you will say, to allow this child to drown because you don't want to go to the expense of replacing your fine clothing. So if that's the case, then it suggests that we ought to be prepared to make some kind of sacrifices, incur some financial expense to save the life of a child when we are not responsible in any way for the child needing to be assisted. It's nothing to do with us, as you say, you know, the parents may have been neglectful, we don't know, but it's certainly not us, and you never voluntarily assumed any responsibility for this child either, by the way. It's not as if the parent said, please keep an eye on my child, I've got to go to the toilet or something. So it's not like that either. So you have no responsibilities except the fact that you can easily prevent something really bad happening. I assume you all think it's really bad for a child to drown, and you can prevent that at a modest cost to yourself. So I think you can probably see where this analogy is going. Once again, it's not a perfect analogy. Some of you may be thinking of differences with this situation, but as I said, in 2019, over 5 million children under 5 died, and most of those deaths were preventable. So they're not like deaths from a form of cancer that we can't cure. We know how to prevent most of those child deaths in a variety of ways, depending on what they're from. Significant number die from malaria. If we distribute bed nets in malaria-prone regions, we dramatically reduce the number of deaths from malaria. If some of them may have died from diarrhea, if we can provide sanitation, or even simple things like chlorine pump dispensers at wells where the wells are likely to be polluted, or by riversides if people are getting water out of a polluted river, and you have a little pump that delivers a measured dose of chlorine to a container. Even things like that can prevent diarrhea and children dying from diarrhea. And there's vaccination programs, immunization can do it as well. So there's a lot of things that we know how to do that will save the life of a child, and they're not going to be particularly expensive. So it does seem that we can save the life of a child, and if we should save the life of the child in the pond, then does it make a difference? And I should say, I'm asking really, does it make an ethical difference that the child is not near to you, the child is not visible to you, and you can't even actually identify the child? So certainly, let's say if you contribute to an effective organisation distributing bed nets, you'll never know whose life you saved. If you do enough of it, you can be pretty confident that you will have saved a child's life, but you'll never know which child's life was saved, because some of the children, well, most of the children, even in malaria-prone regions, would have survived, but some of them would not have, and you don't know which are which. So there's no identifiable child, and that does seem to make a difference to our feelings, our psychology about the issue. But does it really make an ethical difference? You know, each child is a specific child. They're real. The fact that you can't see them in front of you, you don't know their name or their age, doesn't really make much difference, as far as I can see, to the tragedy involved in a child dying. Okay. Just if you want some more facts on this, there's an organisation called GiveWell that employs researchers to try to cost various ways of saving lives or of improving the quality of lives. And they say that this can be done for something in the vicinity of $3,000 to $5,000. And giving the bed nets is one of the things that falls within that range. Each net is very cheap, but you do have to give out a number of nets in order to be confident that you've saved someone's life. And of course, there is some cost in having an organisation that makes the bed nets available, that distributes them in remote parts of the world, that has people out who can educate the people who need them on how to use the nets. So there is more than the cost of the net to it, but still, it's a relatively cheap thing. Maybe it's a bit more than the cost of a pair of expensive shoes, depending what shoes you buy, but it's not, you know, for people living in an affluent society, it's certainly not beyond the means of many people to save a life or to save multiple lives in that way. Okay, now, as I said, the analogy is not perfect, so let's just look at some of the differences that people might talk about. Some might say, sorry, I'm actually just going over it here. So we agreed that it would be wrong, or most of us agreed, to allow the child to drown. I'm suggesting that there are no morally relevant differences between the drowning child situation and that of us with regard to the avoidable poverty-related deaths. And so the conclusion is that it's wrong for affluent people to allow children to die from these avoidable poverty-related causes. Okay, what might we do then? Well, I talked about the effective altruism movement being a little bit more than 10 years old. One of the first people to get involved in this is this man, Toby Ord, who was a graduate student in philosophy at Oxford when I first encountered him. And he contacted me because of the earlier article that I'd written, which had the drowning child in the pond, an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality. And he, like quite a few other philosophy students, had read that article and was impressed by it, but thought that I should have placed more emphasis on trying to do the most good that you can with whatever resources you can donate. So in other words, he thought there wasn't enough emphasis in my article on seeking the most effective options to help people. And so he decided to try to do that, and he was interested in also in how much good he could do if he were to do that. So, as I say, he was a graduate student in philosophy, he was doing well. He could be reasonably confident that when he graduated he would get a job in philosophy, and over the years there's a fairly normal trajectory for good philosophy graduate students to get low-level jobs that are fairly lowly paid for a few years, then to move up, perhaps eventually to become a professor and be reasonably well paid, and at least in England, to then retire at, I think, 67 is the current retirement age in England, but I could be a bit wrong about that. But so it's fairly predictable how much you'll actually earn over your lifetime, much more so than if you're, got a startup that you're working on or something of that sort. So he was interested in how much good he could do by continuing to live on something like the studentship that he was then living on. I think it was about £14,000 a year, a decade or so ago. So he thought, well, suppose that I don't need to spend much more than that, or I'll give myself another couple of £1,000 to spend. But suppose I live more or less as I'm living now, and I give away the rest. So then you can calculate the sum that you'll have to give away, and the second step then is to say, so how much good can I do with that? So he looked at a few things, and he didn't actually come up with malaria nets. He came up with something different, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But he looked at he calculated a few different things. So one charity that is quite visible is training guide dogs to help people who are blind. And this looks like a good thing to do. Helps people who are blind to have a guide dog. Why not contribute to a charity that trains the guide dogs, and also you have to train the blind person using the guide dog to use them effectively and well. So Ord calculated that over his lifetime, with the money that he'd saved, he could provide guide dogs for 50 blind people. Okay, that's a nice thing to do. But then he looked at a different thing that he could do, and that is, I thought I had a slide there before this one actually. Well, maybe it comes after it. Yes, no? Anyway, we'll get to it, don't worry. Or he found a way in which he could actually, with the same amount of money, he could prevent 80,000 people becoming blind. So this is a Stadium Australia, a stadium now used, I think, for football mostly, but it was used for the Sydney Olympics, I think it was built for. Capacity of just over 80,000. So you imagine all of those people in that stadium, and they would all go blind if it wasn't for you. Well, that would be pretty amazing, wouldn't it? Wouldn't you think, wow, I'd really lived a great life if I could do that? Is that really possible? Wouldn't I have to be like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or whatever and make a huge amount of money, not just be an academic. Academics don't make really big money. And the answer is no. And just go on with a comparison. So the reason that Toby could only train about 50 guide dogs is that it's actually quite expensive to train a guide dog because it takes labour. You're talking about labour, people working in affluent countries at those salaries. So it costs around $40,000 to train a guide dog. And here's what Toby instead came across doing, treating trachoma. Now, trachoma is a microorganism that gets in people's eyes in countries typically that are hot and dusty. There are some of those not very far from here, and I think this is somewhere in North Africa, French-speaking North Africa, it seems to be, not that far from here, no doubt. And it gets in people's eyes, and at first you don't notice anything, but gradually it starts to blur the vision. And if you don't treat it, then by the time these children are in their 40s, they've got very blurred vision, and many of them will be blind in their go blind in their 40s and 50s. So it's quite simple to treat. It can be prevented. The study that Ord was using, which was published in a medical journal, suggested that it costs about $25 per case of blindness prevented. So that's why this is so much more effective than training guide dogs. $25 to prevent a case of blindness as against $40,000 to provide a guide dog to a blind person, which is surely not as good as preventing blindness, because most blind people would rather have their sight restored or not have gone blind in the first place than have a guide dog. And that's a good example of the importance of thinking about effectiveness in your altruism. Because otherwise you might think, oh, guide dogs, yeah, that's a good thing to do, that's what I should do, and neglect things like charities that are working to treat trachoma. So if you look at it here, you can see we have an affluent harbour not very far from here with a lot of boats and things that are quite expensive. Some of you I know saw this slide yesterday. So it's possible to do a great deal of good if you're in the class of people who have this boat, not necessarily the big one out front, but there's a lot more in the marina behind. And I think we ought to be thinking about what we're going to be spending our money on when the world is such that we can do a great deal of good with the resources that we have. So I'll just say, somebody yesterday when I talked about this said, well, all of these boats provide employment, and here in Malta I can see why you would think that. They provide employment for the people who are looking after them and for the tourist industry. And that's true, but it's still a comparison, right? Yes, you're employing people who are mostly already in an affluent country and are not going to be in extreme poverty even if they lose their job. And as comparison with that, you can provide employment in low-income countries where the jobs will be much more needed. You may be providing employment to people to distribute bed nets, for example. You want to use local people, of course, who speak the local language. You want to train them. You can do more of that. You will also be providing employment, and in addition, I think you will be having the extra good of preventing children dying from malaria, or providing sanitation so that they don't die from diarrhea, or preventing blindness. So I'll stop at that so that we have some time for questions. We're getting close to 8 o'clock, but I'm sure we'll still have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I may just add one little point, it's not just about speaking, it's also about actions. And I would just like to refer that Professor Peter Singer in 2021 received the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture with prize money of $1 million, which he donated to different organizations. So it's not just about talking, it's also about talking.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I was really glad to have the opportunity to do that, of course. Yes.
So, we have some time for questions. Yes, please. When asking questions, please stand up so that...
Thank you very much for both your talks. Were very interesting. I'm not an economist. I don't understand very much about the global situation, so it's very difficult to know how to help in the most effective way. And I find, usually you try and help someone, and if someone else finds out about it, they say, oh, if I can use your analogy, why did you save that one child? Didn't you know there are 5 children drowning in another pond somewhere? Which can also be very, very disheartening. And I think, if you're focusing about maximizing happiness, focusing on maximizing happiness and being as effective as you can, there's always someone who has a better idea, or something who feels that there is a more important issue, something more important, to spend your money on if all you're doing is giving charity. So I wonder, so in my life, what I've done basically is gone back to those around me, people I happen to know, people I happen to care about, countries I happen to have a connection with, because you have to. Otherwise I'm going to spend my whole life, trying to work out where my charity would be best spent, because I wonder if you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I do have something to say about that, and I'm pleased that you've given me an opportunity to say it. You don't have to spend your whole life trying to work out which are the best charities. There are other people who've done it for you, and the information is available online. I have mentioned already GiveWell. You can find them at givewell.org. I also I wrote a book that is available there called The Life You Can Save, and an organisation grew out of that. I can't say that I really founded it. I suppose I co-founded it with a man called Charlie Bressler, who read the book, wrote to me and said, there ought to be an organisation that is promoting these ideas and getting more people to give. And I said, great, but I don't really have time to do that. And he said, well, I do, because I'm in my 60s and I've had a reasonably successful career in the retail men's clothing industry. And so I've got enough money, but I never really felt that selling clothes to men was what I wanted to spend my life doing. So he set up the organisation, got it registered as a charity, and so you can also go now to thelifeyoucansave.org, and incidentally, you can download an ebook or an audio book if you want to from there, but you can also look at a recommended list of about a little bit over 20 charities, where, again, other people have done the work for you. They've looked at which are the most effective charities, independent assessments, not just relying on what the charities themselves say. So I think that, if somebody else is going to, if you give to one of those charities and someone else is going to jump up and say, well, this one is better, you can ask them, what research they have done that compares with the research that GiveWell or The Life You Can Save, or there are some other organisations that The Life You Can Save draws on, and show why they think that these are not the most effective charities, specifically working in this area of global poverty.
Questions? Yes, over here, gentlemen.
Hi, hi. I'm a teacher. I have it's not a question. I'm going to ask you to comment on something. The idea that we should all give more is clearly unassailable in my view. But there's maybe a more important question that I would ask you to comment on. Maybe we should stop taking so much, because it's quite clear that the problem we look at is not out there. When we talk about global poverty and hunger, the problem is here. We saw that with the animal liberation argument. So for me, the issue is not really seeing how much good we can do, but how much harm we individually, collectively, and institutionally can stop inflicting on other people, for example, through my pension scheme, just to pick a very small example.
So what is your pension scheme doing that you regard as harmful?
Well, the first question was, well, what is the pension scheme doing? And of course, we discovered the pension scheme is involved, for example, in fossil fuel.
Okay.
So just to take that one example.
I thought it might be that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, but it's just the general notion.
Yeah.
The UN figures make it very, very clear that the transfer of resources in the world is from there to here, not the other way around.
Okay, so I don't entirely agree with that, because that assumes that we have the size of the pie is fixed, right? And if you're talking about the transfer of resources going from there to here, I think that's somewhat misleading because the size of the pie is not fixed. In fact, the size of the pie has grown enormously over the last, whatever period you take almost, over the last 20 years, 50 years. Now, it's true that, of course, in saying it's grown enormously, it's grown much more in the affluent countries. But it has grown to some extent in a number of countries that did have a lot of poverty and that don't now. And China is the biggest example of that. Right? You don't have to go back very far to when those figures that I showed, the number of people living in extreme poverty, a substantial proportion of those figures would have been people in China. It would have been maybe 300-400 million people in extreme poverty in China. And that isn't the case now. It's hard to know how many people there are in extreme poverty in China, but it's probably in the tens of millions and not 100 million. So the fact that China has opened up and that we buy things from China has helped a lot of people come out of extreme poverty. And that's happened in a number of other countries as well. Bangladesh would be another example. There was a book by Garrett Hardin written in the 70s, I think it was called Lifeboat Earth or something like that, in which basically he was saying that we should stop giving aid to Bangladesh because it was only going to mean that their population would grow and that more people would face famine. Bangladesh was a basket case, he said, that would never escape the dire poverty it was in. Well, Bangladesh has a clothing industry that sells a lot of clothes to the West, and although the population of Bangladesh is larger now than it was in the 70s, it's not growing very quickly anymore, and certainly the number of people in extreme poverty in Bangladesh has also fallen. So I think that when we talk about climate change, we have a completely different story, and that's why I was interested in whether that was what you're referring to about the pension fund. Because we have much higher rates of greenhouse gas emissions than low-income countries, and because the impact of climate change will be most severe on low-income countries, for two reasons. One is most of them are in hotter climate zones, really three reasons. Secondly, more people are dependent on rainfall for their agriculture. And also, I've gone blank now, sorry. And the other reason is that they basically don't have the kind of insurance, not in the narrow sense of insurance, but they don't have the other options. When climate change strikes, they're not going to be able to move away from low-lying coastal areas and farm somewhere else, as people in affluent countries are more apt to do. So I think that that's a dire problem, and that I think justifies you in saying that we are harming them by contributing to climate change. And that's a separate and, as I said, extremely important issue. But exactly what forms of consumption we should cut back on, I tend to agree that we are incredibly wasteful, and that relates to environmental damage, including climate change. But I don't think we should cease to buy things from poorer countries than ourselves. I think that would actually harm them. And I think the real problem of the 800 or so million people in extreme poverty is that they can't get into that global economy. A disproportionate number of them are living in places where they simply do not have the ability to make something for the global market. There's very poor transport where they're living. If you look at landlocked countries, they tend to be poorer than countries that have coastal countries. Obviously, there are exceptions like Switzerland, but you look at some of the poorest countries in Africa, they don't have access to ports, and so they can't really get into those global markets. So I don't think we want to go back to an economy where we only buy locally or we don't buy from the rest of the world. I think we want to help people who, for various reasons, are not able to trade their way or work their way out of poverty because of the situation that they're in. And that's why I've been focusing on what we can do to help through aid organizations. Thanks.
So, gentleman there, and then we have someone there as well.
Thank you. As a student and humanitarian, actually, this topic is, as you may imagine, of high importance for me. I actually, after what you said, have 3 questions, more or less. Sorry for not being able to reduce it to more. The first is, when we talk about, like what you said, poverty and development and moving people out of poverty by development, I'm always struck by the question, how can we sustain an endless development of economies when this development is based on the exploitation of ending resources? So how can we match these two? And the second question is, I love altruism, and I think it is very important to help people around the world. Yet for me also, what I also see is there's a mushrooming of NGOs and organizations that rush to the help, often making things a lot more complicated at place. So how can we strike a balance between the innovative potential of new NGOs and making sure that funds are used in the most effective way? And question number 3 would be, how can we strike a balance between altruism to people that live far away, whilst not forgetting about the people that live also in bitter poverty right next to our door? Thank you.
Okay, a lot of different questions. So the balance between those far away and those close to us, I do think we should go for where we can make the biggest difference with a small amount of money, or with whatever amount of money we can donate. And if we're living in an affluent country, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to do that, that's going to be people who are close to us. Because most affluent countries, even the United States, which is really bad in this respect, have social welfare nets. And say in the United States, if you're really poor, you can get food stamps. It's pretty demeaning maybe, but food stamps are worth over $4 a day. So you're already not in extreme poverty, and you can maybe get housing aid as well. So, you know, think about it in terms of that income of $2 a day. So that's, you know, clearly less than $1,000 a year. Imagine that you can donate $1,000 this year. And imagine that through an organization, there is such an organization, it's called Give Directly, you can donate $1,000 to them and $900 will go to a very poor family. 10% goes for the administration of the organization, which after all, you couldn't get the money to that very poor family otherwise. So $900 to a family that's on $2 a day is going to more than double their annual income. Giving to somebody locally, you know, I'm sure there is poverty in Malta, there's poverty in Australia and the United States, but it's not $1,000 or $900 is not really going to make a life-changing difference to them in the way it would in some of those other countries. Okay, one of your other questions was how can we keep this sort of trade that I was talking about in the previous answer, or comment on the previous remark, when we're simply using up finite resources. Well, we may not be. We may be doing things like, you know, I've talked about climate change and fossil fuels. We really, you know, fossil fuels are finite resources, although unfortunately there's still far more of them than the planet could sustain us in burning. But we can develop clean energy, solar energy, for example, in many poor countries. And that's not using up finite resources. So I think there are ways in which we can develop new resources. Technology is constantly changing and constantly enabling us to overcome some of those resource traps. I know there was a third question which I've now forgotten, but maybe answering 2 questions is enough, and we should, as there are other people, we should move on.
Hello. So thank you so much for your lecture today. And in listening to your argument about effectiveness, I can't help but wonder about the consequentialist, seemingly consequentialist take on things. In that if one's ethical considerations are measured by the quantity, in a way, of how many people are going to benefit in the end. But for example, if we take examples that we've heard so many times where charities accept donations from dubious sources, for example, where the output is seemingly good, but it might be the case that they're doing harm and indirectly in another area, in an area which might seem more invisible to the PR machine, so to speak. And the good side is much more visible. So obviously the image is all about that. Obviously it's not all charities, but the super charities, the big ones, some of them we've heard cases of these sorts. So how would that argument apply in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, well, a consequentialist is going to ask what are going to be the consequences of taking money from dubious sources. And it may be that the corporation is going to use this to whitewash, or if it's a fossil fuel organization, greenwash what it's doing. And that may have very bad consequences, and that may outweigh the good that you can do with the money. But there might be other cases where it's not going to be used in that way. So a consequentialist is always going to ask that question. If I take this donation, will the corporation publicize it? Is the corporation doing really bad stuff, which many people will think more favorably of because they're making these donations and they can see that this charity accepted it and they're sponsoring this charity? In that case, you might refuse it. But if somebody hands you money that maybe they've earned through fossil fuels or like the opioids, through manufacturing opioids, the Sackler family has been involved in a lot of philanthropy and through their pharmaceutical company is also responsible for essentially addicting millions of Americans to opioids. Again, if you're going to somehow take the money in a way that benefits them and makes them avoid some of the consequences of what they've been doing, no, don't take it. But if they say, look, you can have this, we're never going to use this in our publicity, and you can save lives with it or restore sight with it, or do other things that are good, a consequentialist is going to say, well, yeah, maybe there's a sense in which it's tainted, but the amount of good that I can do with it is more important than that.
So I have a gentleman there in the middle.
Hello? Yeah. I guess you could draw a similarity between his question and my question, but I'll leave you to interpret that. Do you think that the failures of certain organizations could be reason enough to be skeptic or limit your own amounts of altruism? For example, how various international organizations debt trap countries or leave them dependent on them, resulting in them being worse off than they were beforehand. Or, for example, how donations in certain African countries, they, for example, donate food, vaccines, bandages, this, that, and the other, but then don't donate anything that can actually improve business and the longevity of how that money can be used in a useful way.
Well, I think, as I've been saying, it's important to do some research or to read the research that others have done and to find the companies that are doing the most effective things. And, yes, there have been scandals. In any large human activity, you're going to get scandals. I think you should be familiar with that. So avoid those charities if you think there are problems. But if you look at the list of charities on the Life You Can Save or the ones GiveWell recommends, they're mostly charities you won't have heard of. There may be a couple of larger ones on those lists, but there are certainly many small charities that have never been involved in any scandals and that are certainly not debt trapping countries, because they're basically they're doing things like distributing bed nets, and there's 10 or 20 people who work for the organisation who are doing that, and that's all they do. Or there may be others that are doing other kinds of things that are quite specific. So the organisations that are recommended mostly are doing fairly specific things that can more easily be assessed as saying, does this work? Does it have any downsides? What is it doing? How much does it cost? What is the cost effectiveness of what they're doing? So that's why I'm recommending if you are giving to charities, that you focus on those ones. And I don't think you should be misled by the fact that every now and again there'll be some newspaper headline about some scandal blowing up with a particular charity. You can note it, but you shouldn't regard that as typical of most of the organizations in the field. I think that's just completely false.
So over there in the middle, please.
Hi. So I'm curious how you factor in future human suffering, because, of course, extreme poverty is a horrible thing, but at the same time, when I think about climate change, it will lead to a lot more poverty, displacement, deaths. So I would argue that it would make sense to donate to organizations working towards climate change.
Okay. So I do completely factor in the future. I don't discount the future at all, except that the further into the future you get, the less certain the effects come, right? But I think climate change is a problem which is clearly having bad consequences now, and if we don't dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, it will continue to have problems for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Now, the carbon, if we can't remove it, will be up in the atmosphere for many centuries, but I think there is an uncertainty factor that comes in. If someone says, this is going to harm people in 200 years, I would say, well, maybe by then we'll have a way of sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere that is cost effective, and so the problem will be solved by then. But I'm not discounting the suffering of people in 200 years. I'm just saying I'm not certain that we'll still need to do this in 200 years. But I think climate change is tremendously important for the reasons that you suggested. The reason that I haven't talked about climate change today, well, partly I guess you don't have time to talk about everything, but you remember that slide I had where I talked about importance, neglectedness, and tractability. Climate change is important, clearly, and I think it's tractable. We know things we can do that will reduce climate change, but it's certainly not neglected. There's a lot of effort going into climate change, as there should be, but your individual contribution might be less effective for that reason. But I say might be with a lot of hesitation. And actually, as you will know, I've heard I'm Australian. So Australia recently had an election, which very surprisingly, the Greens quadrupled their representative in the federal parliament. That's from a low number of 1, so it's a bit easier to quadruple than if you already had 20. But still, that's significant. And more unusual, a group of independents got elected who are all put climate change as their #1 issue. And they won seats that had never been held by anybody except the Conservative Party since Federation, since 1901. At least one seat in that category, and several other seats that were considered conservative strongholds. So it's a really remarkable result, and it did take some money. And in fact, it took the son of one of Australia's billionaires, a man called Simon Holmes à Court, to set up an organisation to fund the independents. It wasn't only his money, many other people donated to it as well. And you might have said before he did that, well, what's the chances that you're really going to get any of these independents elected, in these safe seats? But obviously it was worth taking that risk. It did happen, and it's going to have an impact. I mean, it also meant that the Liberals were defeated. The Labor Party may or may not have an absolute majority in the Parliament. There are a couple of seats not decided yet, but it will certainly want support from some of the independents and the Greens. So I think we're going to see a much stronger action on climate change as a result of political action in this case, not as a result of individual donations to a charity really so much, than we had in the previous government. And obviously I welcome that. So I'm not at all saying, you can't do anything about climate change, that it's not worth donating to. There are clearly some political strategies that can make a difference, and if you have a hope of making that difference, by all means I would say, give it a try.
So I think at the end of this enjoyable evening, a word of thanks is due, first and foremost to Professor Peter Singer and to Professor Katarzyna de Lazari Radek for having accepted our invitation. And we would like to give you a token for your efforts.
Thank you.
A token of
Beautiful
Malta.
book on Malta. Lovely, lovely souvenir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think a word of thanks is also due to Professor Claude Manjon and to Francois Zamit, who willingly accepted to help us in this annual lecture. Obviously, a word of thanks even to you all for having accepted our invitation and participated in this annual lecture. And I would like to thank also the other members of the committee, Ian and his family, because all the family was involved in the organization. A word of thanks to Val. A word of thanks to Valdera. A word of thanks also to Lennox, who couldn't make it this evening, and again to Francois, who is also a member of the committee. But I think I am in duty bound to give a very big thank you to Ian, because he left no stone unturned, as it goes, for bringing over Professor Singer this evening. Thank you, Ian. Before we close, those of you who would like to know more about our foundation, obviously you find some information in the brochure, which you obviously can take with you. And near the door, there is the desk where there are books which were written by both professors. And those of you who would like to become members of the foundation, there are even application forms so that you can become members. And we would keep you informed of all the activities which the foundation holds. Hopefully, we are getting back to normal after the 2-year absence, so that you will be able to participate in our activities. Thank you very much once again. Have a nice evening, and I think I can say au revoir for next year. Thank you.
Thank you.